Hi, welcome to Theology Thursday, a weekly video that I do about biblical or theological topics. By the way, my name is Paul Smith, and I'm the pastor at First Baptist in Chandler, Arizona. So today I want to talk about remembering, or maybe more specifically, never forgetting. And I want to do this by taking a case study. So in the New Testament, we have 4 lists of the apostles. Jesus called 12 men out of the many followers that he had. There were 12 of them specifically called to be the 12 apostles. And when we look at these 4 lists, they are almost identical. There are a couple places where we have a different name, probably due to the author of that list knowing that apostle by a different name. So this is not that uncommon. I've actually known people that some folks call them by their first name and some people call them by their middle name. Some people go by a nickname. And so I realize that, it is very possible that we could have, there's only 1 or 2 that are like that. The first 3 names are always the same and always in the same order every time. And so we have Peter, John, and James are always listed as the first 3 of the apostles. And there will be Jesus' inner circle out of the 12 apostles. What's really interesting is that when you look at these lists, there are very few comments. They're not descriptions of these men. The comments are almost always distinguishing comments. For example, we have a couple guys named James. So there's James the Less, which probably just means he's the shorter guy, or something like that. We have Judas, who's the son of James, or Judas not Iscariot. So there are a couple of the names that are repeated. More than one person in the group has that name. And so there is a distinction between Judas Iscariot and Judas not Iscariot, or Judas, son of James, or the 2 Jameses, James, the son of Alphaeus, or James. It is interesting, though, that Judas Iscariot in all 4 lists is called a betrayer, a son of perdition, or something like that. So in all 4 lists, we see a reference to the character of Judas. He's really the only one that's described that way. All the rest of them are just to distinguish between individual names. But actually his character, who he is described in all 4 Gospels, so we know who it is that was the betrayer. So that in mind, let's look at these lists. Now, it's fascinating to me. You would expect, 4 lists, that makes sense. We have 4 Gospels, 4 biographies of Jesus' life, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So that's where the 4 lists would be. But that's not exactly true. There are not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So in the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 13, we have a list. In Luke 6:12-16, we have a list. So Luke wrote both Luke and Acts. And he gives the second list in Acts to let us know about the 11 apostles who are still alive and still there after Judas had taken his own life. And then we have Mark, and Mark 3:13-19 gives us a list of the apostles. But before I look at the 4th list, I want to read a verse to you that's going to set the stage, the scene, the context for what I want to talk about. So in Matthew chapter 9, verse 9, we read this. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. He said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. Now let me say a word about the tax booth. Tax collectors were hired by the Roman Empire, and they were always locals that they hired. People that spoke the language and all of that. And so they would hire a local. And they would tell the tax collector for your zone or your region or your station, if it was like a poll tax where people had to pay to go down a street or whatever it was, they would give them a quota. This is how much you are to raise. So let's just say, for instance, that a tax collector was hired out by the Roman Empire and in modern terms was told, hey, you need to raise $200,000 this year from that booth that you're working. So you need to tax $200,000 in Roman denarii, Roman coins. And for your work, we're going to pay you $75,000. So you get a $75,000 salary to raise $200,000. So you calculate out how many people come through and how much you need to charge per person to get $200,000. But man, you see an opportunity. Rome wants $200,000, but what if you raise $300,000 in taxes? What if instead of charging 5% per person, you charge 7% per person? What do you do then? What do you do with that extra money? Well, as tax collector, you keep it. Your job is to raise $200,000 in Roman money to send back to Rome. That's your job. That's what you're paid for. But if you raise $300,000, you send Rome $200,000, you keep the $100,000, and you get your $75,000 salary. Man, it was a sweet deal financially. But because these tax collectors would gouge their own people on behalf of the Roman Empire, they were hated and despised. And why wouldn't they be? One, because of what they're doing financially, but two, they're sinners. They're stealing from people. They're lying to the Roman government. They're lying to people, telling them you got to pay this much in tax. So tax collectors are viewed as some of the scumbaggest people in the Roman Empire. And certainly in Judea, they would have been viewed that way because they're selling out. They would have been Jewish and selling out their own Jewish people to make a profit off their own citizens, many of whom were suffering financially. And so they were viewed as some of the most wicked and despicable people that there was. But they got wealthy doing it, so people would be willing to do that. So Matthew was a wicked, despised criminal extorting people on behalf of the Roman government. And he knew his place in society. He knew what people thought of him because he was a tax collector. So I'll say that because I want to actually go now to the fourth list, and that is in Matthew chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, where Matthew is now going to give us his list of the apostles. So Jesus called him the 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out, and to heal every disease and every affliction. The names of the 12 apostles are these: first, Simon, who's called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, distinguish him from Simon who's called Peter, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, I don't know if you caught it in here. Again, there are terms, this guy's brother, so we know who is who, because we have several people with the same names. And this guy's the son of this one over here, and that sort of thing. And so that's the only comment we get in these lists, except in Matthew. Of all the four lists, if you read them all four lists, the only person who's described in terms of his actions, his character, is Judas, the betrayer. Matthew chapter 10, verse 3 is the one lone exception. Matthew, the tax collector. This is in the Gospel of Matthew, describing himself as a disciple. So here's what I want you to catch. Matthew, writing this years later, as he writes his biography of Jesus' life, has never forgotten what the grace of God did in his life. He has never forgotten, I was a tax collector until I met Jesus. I was a criminal until I met Jesus. I was an extortioner until I met Jesus. I was a liar until I met Jesus. I was full of greed and avarice until I met Jesus. He never forgot what Jesus did in his life, ever. And this has always been one of my favorite littlest kind of things that's dropped in the Bible that's really easy to overlook. I remember the first time I saw it, I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder if it's that way in the rest. And I went and looked at the other list, wow. To the rest of the guys, he's just Matthew, one of the disciples. But man, for him, he never forgot, ever. I think there's a great lesson in there for you and me, that we should never forget what the grace of God has done in our life. That's who I was. This is who I am. I could still be that if it were not for the grace of God. Jesus has changed me. I was that. I was the tax collector, but now I'm a disciple. And so it's a great lesson for us. I think it's also a great reminder that the people that God uses are not always the most faithful. They're not always the ones that are raised in a Christian home. They're not always the ones that kind of have it together. But oftentimes God goes down into the worst of places and gets the worst of people, a scumbag tax collector, and pulls them out and transforms them. That's what the grace of God does. God's grace is not limited to just the people that are already pretty good, right? Jesus said, I didn't come to heal, I didn't come for those that are healthy. He said, I come for those who are sick. Those are the ones that need a physician. And so Matthew never forgot, and I hope that you will never forget what Jesus has done in your life. That's who you were, but now this is who you are in Jesus Christ. So I want to encourage you, be like Matthew and never forget what the grace of God has done in your life. And I hope that has bring you some encouragement and some joy and some worship in your life for the remainder of this week and through the weekend. So God bless you.